Welcome to this lecture video on policy analysis. Here what I have before you is an example of a policy analysis sketched out in relationship to some of the guidelines that are derived in part from Bardach's A Practical Guide to Policy Analysis. In this module, the module on policy analysis, there's a required reading, and it's Bardach, and it's I think the 2000 version of A Practical Guide to Policy Analysis. Even though it's the 2000 version, all of this material is still relevant. You'll find all of these categories in there in terms of a process for engaging in policy analysis. Now, this is not the policy-making process, right? This is a different sort of conceptual framework for understanding how to go about analyzing policy. I know in the last module we talked a little bit about both the policy-making process and also about evaluation, policy evaluation, but here we're focused entirely on analysis. I know I've also indicated that both policy and evaluation, and analysis are similar in kind. You'll see some overlap between some of the things that we talked about in terms of evaluation and also in this subject area, policy analysis. So I'm going to give an overview, and then I'm going to give an example. And the example I'm going to look at is sea level rise. And if you'll recall, one of the examples I gave you at the very beginning of this course in the first video lecture was on sea level rise and trying to explain what is public policy, looking at some of the problems related to coastal flood insurance specifically with sea level rise. So here we're going to try to incorporate this policy analysis model and apply it to sea level rise and climate change and some of the issues that derive there. But first, let's get an overview of policy analysis. So there are a number of steps, and this is identified in great detail in the Bardach reading. But the steps that are identified here are summarized as follows. First of all, you identify the current issue. So you, in policy analysis, have to identify something that's an issue. I mentioned in the last video that often the evaluation process for policies is to look at the implementation or the legitimization of the policy, to look at the policy itself and ask yourself, is it meeting its goals? And now, I also mentioned that there's somewhat of a superficial analysis that one can do, and we call that output. You could look at the output of the policy to try to get a determination as to whether or not the policy is doing its job. That's very superficial. For example, we talked about No Child Left Behind. That was identified, and we could say that, well, if graduation rates were low before the implementation of something like No Child Left Behind, then you implement No Child Left Behind. Now graduation rates tend to increase after that implementation. That kind of analysis might tell you something, might tell you that No Child Left Behind had some impact on graduation rates, but it doesn't really tell you exactly what impact it had. And what was proffered in the previous lecture video was that maybe that policy, not necessarily No Child Left Behind, but a similar policy, could have an effect where it discourages students from moving forward. It holds students back. So the policy might be supporting higher graduation rates, but not because it's helping students gain a better understanding, which might be the goal of the policy, but because it's taking the sort of weaker students and holding them back, keeping them back, so they're not able to move forward. And if that's the case, if that's true, then you have an issue there. And that kind of deeper policy analysis or evaluation in the context of the previous video suggests that you're looking at the impacts of the policy. And in that case, if all of that's true, we could say that the impact of the policy is to hold students back from getting to the point of being considered potential graduates, rather than helping them understand the concepts and the basic learning, filling gaps essentially in their knowledge to allow them to progress and become successful and move towards graduation. And we would assume that is the goal of an education-related policy. The goal wouldn't be to just marginalize students that aren't making the grade, right? The goal would be to help those students, identify them, and help them move forward. So in that case, in an impact analysis as opposed to a more sort of output-based analysis, we dig a little bit deeper and we might find sort of correlative issues like that. We might say that, it's not just, the policy isn't just making kids smarter or improving educational outcomes for kids. The policy is just holding back some of the lower performing kids, and so they're not being measured in terms of the graduation statistics. They're not part of that pool, so you have an artificial inflation of graduation rate. I think that should make sense. But anyway, you have to identify a current issue, something that is of issue, and that usually is an existing policy. It might not be, by the way. It could be something where you're suggesting a policy intervention. For example, you see an issue out in the world that really excites you, and policy analysis is fun in that sense, in that you can really dig your teeth into something that's, maybe hasn't gotten a full sort of level of attention. And what you're doing is you're trying to bring it to the agenda by analyzing a social issue, a societal issue. It could be economics, it could be financially based, it could be socially based, welfare, a number of different, almost anything, any human endeavor. You could look at it and say, look, this is either an existing policy and I'm looking at it for a variety of reasons. It needs to be changed, it's doing really good and it needs to be highlighted, whatever it might be. Or it could be, look, we need to move this policy onto the agenda. We need to move this issue to something that gets to legitimation. We need to focus on this. And so you're trying to create maybe a focusing event by identifying some issues. All of those things are potential in policy analysis. So there's identification of a current issue. The next step, down from the top, is to define the issue as a problem needing fixing. It's kind of what I just summarized, right? You identify that there's something wrong. There's something wrong because there's an issue that's really important for society and there's no policy directly addressing that issue, or there's an existing issue. Maybe the No Child Left Behind example that I was using from the previous video and summarized here. There's an existing policy and it's broken, it's not working effectively, it needs to be changed. The point is you have to identify a problem. And what I've identified on the right here with the arrow is that generally is the most important part. And it's one of the most difficult parts, by the way. Not that this matters necessarily in this course so much, but certainly if you take other classes, I know that in certain classes you're required, particularly in the MPP program, but even in the graduate certificate programs, but even if you're taking this course and you're focused in other areas, if you're in law, if you're in business, many times it's really about understanding a lot of people think of issues as large scale. They're broad and they're conceptual. Education is an issue. Education is a really big category, right? It's a really big issue. And the question is, well, what are we talking about here? And education would be probably an inappropriate subject area for policy analysis. Because you could just say, I guess, education is a problem, for example, but that doesn't really help, does it? Well, what about education specifically is a problem? And is that being done everywhere the same way? I mean, is this a universal problem or is this a specific problem to a region? When you identify a problem, what I'm trying to get at here is that you need to really refine your issue statement. You need to refine it to a very specific statement. A subcategory of a subcategory of a subcategory is something that I often say to students when talking with them. The sub-issue of the sub-issue of the sub-issue. Or knowing a lot about something that is a very defined, right? Very defined question. So we've used does No Child Left Behind help yield higher graduation rates? That's a pretty specific question. That is a pretty specific question. Or a better question is, if you were to look into the law itself and look at some of its implementation, how it's implemented, you might take a piece of that implementation and say, does this thing, this specific thing that's in No Child Left Behind, the way that they're doing this thing, does that help to yield higher graduation rates, or does it do something else? Right? I mean, so you can get, the more specific you can be in identifying your problem, the better. The easier it is to handle, right? So we've used models previously. We've talked in previous parts of this course about modeling to simplify the world because the world's very complex. Well, in policy analysis, the approach many would recommend, I certainly would recommend, that anyone takes is that they look at the problem and they really get as specific as they can, a very specific problem statement, question that needs to be answered. And the more specific, the better, because it is very complex. And through specificity in defining the problem, you help to identify very specific criteria, and it's more likely that it's manageable, that you can actually, there are not too many variables, there are not too many factors that you have to look at to help answer the question. So anyway, when you do this in terms of defining your problem, not only is it very important, but you have to consider the assumptions you're making. Often we make many assumptions when we do these sort of things, so you have to consider the assumptions. After you define the problem, then you need to find evidence. Evidence that supports the fact that there's a problem, right? So I hope you can understand that in finding evidence to support the problem. Wow, it probably makes sense to be very specific in the problem statement. So some evidence to support the problem. The more specific the problem statement, the easier it is to do that. And you also have to consider alternatives. Alternatives to that, what you're presuming the problem to be. Like, I think the problem is this, right? That's your sort of hypothesis. But you might have to have alternative hypotheses, which is, well, it's the opposite, the null hypothesis, right? It's not this, it's that, right? It's not 1, it's 10, something like that. You have to consider it's not 1, it's 7, it's not 1, it's 3. And you have to consider all of these alternatives. But you have to go out and get evidence, and evidence digging is difficult. And I know that in certain courses, if you continue along in the program, specifically with Professor Angelov, any courses that you end up taking, without naming names, that focus on sort of research methodology, policy analysis, applied policy research, statistics, you need to understand where the world of evidence is at. And that means going into the scholarship, primary literature, and finding out where in that specific question some of this research has already been done, and what is the state of the art. Where is that scholarship today on that question, on answering that question? Without knowing that, you won't know what the alternatives are, and you really won't know what the evidence is, because you won't know what evidence has already been unearthed. So that's the difficult part, but you find some evidence. And then after that, you select some criteria. Selecting criteria means that you look at those things that you think are important factors to analyze this problem, this issue, right? So the more specific the problem, the less of these criteria that you need in order to analyze it. That's why it's very important. Then you project your outcomes. Projecting outcomes means that once you've selected the criteria, you're going to presume that the outcomes are if this, then that, if this, then that. Think of like a decision tree or a logic sort of progression. Then you need to project your outcomes, after projecting your outcomes, then you confront your trade-offs. And confronting the trade-offs, benefits versus cost effectiveness, but this is where we get into, and in the materials there's a decent amount of sort of background videos and information on benefit cost analysis, how it's done, why it's done, what the purpose of it is, I mean from a financial, economic, social, from different perspectives. But you need to confront trade-offs, which is, just because, as it shows you in some of those sort of cost-benefit videos, just because you can make money doing something, or you think you can, it doesn't mean that it's the ideal situation, because you could probably make more money, or maybe you can make more money in one of the alternatives. So an alternative might be better in that way. In the environmental field, my area of specialty, often you think about trade-offs in terms of you might have a direct economic benefit, but it might have a lot of negative externalities vis-a-vis the environment. And those are things that we all share. So you might be able to internalize the benefits, but the costs actually exceed the benefits. It's just that the entity is able to externalize many of those costs. Some would argue that carbon, anything that we do with carbon, since we don't tax or we don't internalize the cost of carbon, that in and of itself is a way in which people profiteer off of the damage of the environment, causing climate change as an externality. But you confront the trade-offs, then you decide, and then you tell your story. Okay? And one of the things that I want to point out, if you look to the left down at the bottom, is values always matter, specifically when you're confronting trade-offs, right? Value judgments. Policy is very much a value-driven process. There's a normative aspect to this. It's hard to be completely objective. You can lay out a number of alternatives. You can look at trade-offs, measure them, do cost-benefit analysis, and come up with a number of alternative approaches. But being able to choose between them is very difficult to do often. Using benefit cost analysis, using a monetary and apples to apples comparison is helpful, but the criteria, the variables that you're using in order to judge, the monetary value of things really matters, and that's where values really come into play. So that always matters. Here's the example. I'm using the exact criteria, the Burdock criteria I've just identified here, the slight variation of it, and I'm applying it to the question of sea level rise, right? So if I wanted to be specific, this is an example. If I was doing sort of a policy analysis and I wanted to do it related to sea level rise, coastal adaptation, climate change, something along the coastline. So if I'm identifying a current issue, I say sea level rise, that's a current issue. And then define the issue as a problem needing fixing. Well, look at it just from the human perspective, maybe, and I say coastal adaptation. Sea level rise is important because it's going to cause disruptions along the coastline, so coastal adaptation is the problem. How do we adapt along our coastlines to sea level rise? Then I need to find evidence to support underlying sea level rise as a problem and the problem for coastal adaptation. So I look for evidence to support, and this is in the literature, peer-reviewed, erosion, subsidence, coastal property dangers, all the things that sea level rise. Obviously, I have to identify sea level rise as a fact. I have to look at the evidence to support, again, the peer-reviewed evidence, to support that it actually is occurring, the rate it's occurring at, where it's occurring significantly, and relative dangers. Some areas are better off than others because of their sort of geomorphology. So very low-lying coastal areas are really at risk, and so I need to understand all of that, but then I have to find evidence not only of sea level rise, but of also how it affects coastal adaptation. And those are all things that I would look for. Who's talking about erosion rates? Who's talking about subsidence issues? What's known about coastal property dangers? And by the way, if it's not out there, then I have to go and do it, right? I have to go and find a way to measure these things, maybe do that research myself, or help, get a grant, that sort of thing. That's usually what we get the science and some of the other folks to do, but we're talking about policy analysis here, but we need to get that information. And sometimes we can make assumptions, by the way. If there are gaps in the information, in the amount of evidence that we can collect, then we can make certain assumptions based on the other evidence, called indirect measures, right? We can say, what we know is this, and if we assume these things because there are these gaps, then all of this holds true. But those assumptions become really important. That, by the way, that's where values also come in. So you find some evidence, then you select criteria, and the criteria would be I either stay or I retreat, maybe. In other words, that coastal adaptation allows you to stay along the coast as sea levels rise, or you have to retreat, you have to move away. And those might be the criteria I use to judge this particular policy proposal or idea or concept, or to evaluate or analyze an existing policy. Project the outcomes. The options of stay versus retreat mixed with the likelihood of sea level rise. So my outcomes would be, look, if you stay and you're in a really low-lying area, right, I'd apply all of those criteria and I'd show an outcome. And then I'd say if you retreated, then the outcome would be this, and right? And that's pretty objective. You can see how we're really limiting the normative aspects of this right now. But that's kind of generally how you go about it in projecting the outcomes. Confronting the trade-offs, there'd be some direct, indirect, and ecological costs. Armoring versus retreating, for example. Like, in other words, if you stay and the only way to prevent a lot of catastrophe, allow people to stay along the coast, is that if you armor, meaning you put up a seawall, for example, you might remove all of the intertidal zone, all of the sand dunes, all of that whole ecosystem, basically. As the water rises, it hits the wall and you lose whatever's there. And there's value there. And this is important because if you don't identify that value, the ecosystem services, for example, the fisheries habitat, then you're not really doing an accurate benefit cost analysis, right? Because you've lost all of that value in your analysis. You miss it. And that can be problematic. But anyway, you confront some of those trade-offs, and then you make a decision. Well, and the decision is where value really comes in. You can either just identify the two options, right, and say, here are the options, and leave it to decision makers to make a decision, of course. Or you can decide, and you can just lay out the alternatives in that decision, which is if you stay, here is a bunch of issues, right? Here is the scenario. Or if you retreat, then here are a bunch of other issues and scenarios, right? You might lose this, but you might gain that. And again, the videos on benefit cost analysis can start whetting your appetite for understanding how to do that. That's kind of interesting. And in other courses, you actually get into doing that. And then you tell your story. You explain the analysis in a succinct writing, right? I mean, that's the most important part, is that you figure out how to write this and you become really good at writing. And you write succinctly executive summaries and then some details, but that's about the process. Here's an example, different example, and I thought I'd just put it out there. It's something that I use in some of the courses that I teach, and I think it's interesting because it engenders a lot of environmental policy. It's the area that I focus on, is environment, but it's something we all deal with: automobiles, driving, and pollution. Pollution's always an issue. And these three scenarios identify three large categorical areas of how currently the United States and many other countries are nationally attempting to deal with carbon and carbon emissions, not just for human health effects, but also for climate change. and the sort of categorical ways in which you can control industrial and personal activities. And so I thought I'd bring these out because these are categorically 3 different ways of looking at something, and they're sort of couched in this example. But so you imagine an automobile pollution. There's going to be 3 different control options. This is option A, the first option, on how to really start controlling the amount of emissions coming out of automobiles in a given state. Just imagine this is a state proposed policy. Use of certain automobiles banned based on emissions, generally older, cheaper automobiles. So this is banning legislation. The implementation, the legitimation of this policy would be a statute, and it would ban old, cheaper automobiles. They're cheaper because they're old. That's what it basically, because the old ones are, gas guzzling, smog automobiles. They don't run efficiently. Individual is left to purchase newer vehicle or find other means of transportation. So there's really no government subsidy to help mitigate the impact. And the government offers no aid or subsidy to those who are affected. All right? So the government just bans old cars, and those who have old cars have to deal with it. They just have to deal with it. They lose their car, and the government offers them no recompense, right? No mitigating factors whatsoever. Now, immediately, many of you might say, hey, wait, that sounds unfair, because if I was to think about this from a financial perspective, people that generally have old cars tend to be those that are, don't have a lot of money. People that have newer cars, or at least can afford newer cars, tend to have a lot of money. I'm going to assume that this is going to have a regressive effect on society, that it's going to affect mostly those that have the least amount of means to deal with it, right? And that's entirely plausible. But you can see that certainly this policy would achieve its goal, and would probably achieve its goal very efficiently. If the goal is, again, to limit carbon emissions, let's say, right, you get rid of some old vehicles, you get rid of almost every old vehicle through a banning legislation, it is clean, right? It's incredibly clean, incredibly efficient in that way, but it has other effects, right? Now, if we only look at it from an output, whether it's meeting its goal, it certainly is. But if we look at impacts, we might say, but it's disproportionate in its impact, if that makes sense. Scenario 2, this is a cap. As opposed to a ban, this is a cap. The government caps the amount of miles allowed to be driven by any particular vehicle. The amount of miles based on pollution measure of automobile. So if your automobile is more of a polluter, then you're going to have less miles that you can drive in total, because the cap is based on how much you pollute. So effectively, older automobiles generally can only travel 5,000 miles per year under the program, on average. So if you're an old automobile, then you can get about 5,000 miles a year. Now, many of you might say, hey, okay, number one, this is better than the ban, because at least you get to keep your car. But 5,000 miles a year, that's not a lot. And, I travel 15, 20,000 miles a year. So if this was applied to me, then effectively it would be a ban. So the question is, this is maybe better than a ban, but it's only marginally better. Now, again, it meets its goal. And the funny thing is, of course, allowing those old cars to travel 5,000 miles a year, it meets its goal less efficiently than the banning legislation, correct? Yes, it does. Because it allows all of those old cars to drive at least 5,000 miles a year, and that's all that extra amount of pollution. So it's not as efficient in meeting its objective, but its impact might be less than the banning, because it doesn't have that significant regressive effect. So maybe you're thinking that, oh, that might be a superior policy, even though it doesn't meet its objective as well. But still, it's inferior in the sense that you're probably saying 5,000 miles a year isn't very fair. Well, here's the third. Instead of a banning legislation, instead of a cap, the government's going to place a tax on all emissions of automobiles. Every automobile is taxed. And the tax is based on the following factors. So we have factors and criteria. The miles driven per year times the emissions of the automobile. How many miles you drive and how much of a emitter your automobile. So those with higher emission vehicles pay a higher rate per mile. This is actually fair in the sense that it's actually a rate. So if you have a high polluting vehicle, then you're going to pay a higher rate for every mile you drive than an efficient vehicle. Then you might drive the same amount of miles, but the money you pay is more because your car emits more, if that makes sense. Those who travel more miles pay a higher tax. Everybody's subject to the tax. So many of you might say, well, this at least seems the fairest because it allows everybody to use all of their vehicles, and there is a pecuniary penalty for having it's probably fairer than the 5,000 miles a year, and it's certainly fairer than the banning legislation for those that can only afford old, dirty cars, right? Because they can continue to drive it, they can modify their driving, They're allowed to drive more than 5,000 miles, but if that tax ends up being too cost prohibitive, then that'll incentivize them to change their behavior. Who knows at what? For some, maybe at 7,000 miles. For some, maybe at 10,000 miles. Again, depending on how much that tax affects them, how expensive it gets for them to drive more and more miles in that given year. Now, many of you might say this is from an output, from a superficial sort of point of view, this one is least likely to meet the objectives of the policy if the policy is to reduce as much as possible the pollution factor of these automobiles. The banning legislation is the best, right? So this one is the least efficient in that sense. However, you might say from an impact standpoint, and again, if you're looking at this from a sort of financial impact on those in society, it seems to be fairest of the three because it still provides a mechanism for individuals. Now, individuals that can't afford anything other than a dirty old car. To the extent that it probably would be more economically feasible than the 5,000. Now, you can do a deeper analysis to just determine that. You can say, well, what would that rate be? And then you could actually figure out how to set the rate, right? You could say, well, the rate should be no more than this for the dirtiest car, because if it's more than that, then it's as bad as the cap, because effectively nobody will be able to afford driving more than 5,000 miles. So maybe you set the rate such that it allows that person to drive at least 10,000 miles before it becomes economically prohibitive, something like that. But again, what we're doing is we're removing the goal because we're thinking deeper. We're thinking about the impact that this has on members of our society, right? So we're moving further and further away from the goal. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that when we think about these things, it's not just a superficial look at the policy, especially when we engage in policy analysis. It's a deeper look at some of the impacts. And it's not just the impacts related to the goals of the policy, but some of those echo effects, the larger impacts, the tangential impacts that can happen over time. So that's it for policy analysis, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much.